You mean their house?
Shalom, everybody.
Yes.
Shalom.
Good to see you all. So we're going to start something new today, and certainly timely. Not simply because the general atmosphere is showing an increase in acts of anti-Semitism, but I'm sure you followed the situation with. Oh, I hear an echo.
Yeah.
Somebody's got a mic open. Besides a rabbi.
There we go. So you followed the situation with Whoopi Goldberg, I would presume, this past week, which of course raised a number of important questions about the intersectionality around the conversation of race and the impact that conversation has on the reality of anti-Semitism. And so today we're going to start a process, and it fits actually within the Jewish calendar quite appropriately, where we're going to look at the history of anti-Semitism. So we can really learn how this has developed and evolved over thousands of years, in fact. One of the things that will, as we look at it, that will stand out is you'll see that what we now call anti-Semitism has had earlier renditions prior to what we now call anti-Semitism, and that it's traceable all the way back to the original origins of our ancestors, of our people. So I am going to share the screen. And let's start the slideshow right from here. And so a couple days ago, we started a new Jewish month. It's the month of Adar. It's in the Talmud in Ta'anit 29a, there's a phrase that says, it's Adar, be happy. And it's interesting, Jewish tradition is not known for making commandments or declarations about how we're to feel. There's a lot of declarations about what we're supposed to do. But here, in relationship to this Jewish month, we're very forthrightly told, it's Adar, be happy, or be happy, it's Adar. And so why would this be? Now, each new Jewish month is called Rosh Chodesh. And the Jewish calendar marks the months by the cycle of the moon. So if it's a new moon, means there's no moon. The new moon is no moon. And when there's no moon, it's a new Jewish month. When it's a full moon, that's halfway through a Jewish month. And that's always around the 14th or 15th of a Jewish month when you see a full moon. And so the new moon, or each new Jewish month, has certain special prayers that are said at the beginning of each new month. But with Adar, we're told to be happy. And it's worth noting, Adar is the month in which Purim takes place. And you know the story of Purim. And parenthetically, let me also say, this year we have two Adars because it's a Jewish leap year this year. And you notice how sometimes Rosh Hashanah is early, sometimes Rosh Hashanah is late. And that's because going by the moon, if we just counted the months by the moon and we didn't correct it, Eventually, Rosh Hashanah would be in the spring, Pesach would be in the fall, because the holidays would be moving little by little around the calendar, which, by the way, is what's done in Islam. That's why Ramadan can happen any time of the year. We, on the other hand, on average, I believe it's 6 times. No, it's more than, it's 9 times in every 17-year cycle. We have a leap year, and we add an extra month to keep the Jewish calendar and the Jewish holidays in alignment with the seasons when those holidays are supposed to occur. So this year is a leap year because we celebrate Adar twice. And that is going to help correct the calendar so it doesn't get out of sync. So Adar 1 is all we usually have in most years, and occasionally we have Adar 2, and Purim would be observed in the second month of Adar in a leap year, namely this year. So we have Purim and Adar, and so why should we be happy when, Purim is a story of near tragedy and the story of Haman, Mordecai, against all odds, are people overcoming the evil of a character of Haman. And remember, interesting, when we hear the name Haman, when we read the Megillah, it says we're supposed to blot out Haman's name. We do that with a grogger, with a noisemaker. And you notice that we don't just do it the first time we hear Haman's name. We do it every time we hear Haman's name. And in a way suggests that Haman keeps reappearing over and over and over and over again. And every time Haman appears, we have to blot out Haman's name. So in the month of Adar, we're supposed to be happy. And it sounds ironic to be happy in the face of a character like Haman that reappears, that requires us to blot out Haman again and again and again and again. And of course, to try to teach the notion that just like there's a repetitive Haman in the story of the book of Esther, there's a Haman in every generation as well. And so the joy of Adar is the joy of knowing that we will never, never forget to blot out the name of Haman whenever Haman appears, that we will stand up to Haman where and whenever Haman appears. And so when we talk about the history of anti-Semitism, there's actually how this hatred of the Jewish people evolved and developed. But the other part of the story, which we don't often talk about, is how we as a Jewish people have responded. And it's worth recognizing our tenacity and our ability to stand up to hatred. And let's be clear, not just hatred directed at us, but hatred directed at others. So that the reason to be happy is that we have an ethic, we have a tradition, we have mitzvot that guide us to blot out the Hamans of every generation, but at the same time also to utilize a term that's become more popular lately, to be upstanders in the face of injustice, not bystanders, but upstanders. And so we say, be happy, it's Adar. There's a lot packed into that seemingly ironic and terse little statement. I mean, it's a reminder that we should feel proud of our survival, how we've stood up to anti-Semitism, and how we stand up for justice wherever injustice rears its ugly presence. So how are we supposed to respond to the reality of anti-Semitism? What would you all say?
We have to stand up and confront it.
Star, be happy. Be happy.
Think standing up to it, confronting it. What else?
I'll tell you.
I just took this class from JLI on anti-Semitism, and it was very interesting. And I can't remember all the content, but at one point they talked about how a lot of the courts in Europe had these courtiers that really would go and practice diplomacy in the court. And then they gave some modern examples of how it's easy to be critical of maybe people that are trying to use diplomacy at higher levels, but that in the end, instead of being very confrontative, in some ways being diplomatic and trying to navigate policies from maybe one nation to the next or one organization to the next, has been a way of curbing anti-Semitism in the larger picture of things.
That's a very interesting comment. I think, well, let's take your comment and put it in the context of Whoopi Goldberg's comment this week. She tried to argue that first, the Holocaust wasn't about race. And she then went on and kind of deepened her, I think, faulty thinking by saying it's not only not about race, the only things that can be about race have to do with skin color. But she said something else, which I think was glossed over. And I'm not trying to in any way support her statement, but I thought of your comment when she said, you know, the thing that was the worst part of the Holocaust was she used the phrase man's inhumanity to man. And again, trying to, I thought, kind of universalize the suffering and the atrocity of the Holocaust. And as I listened to you make your comment, the notion of fighting anti-Semitism by kind of universalizing the experience and then trying to build alliances around the world to stand up against all forms of hate, where we become part of developing an alliance to stand up to all forms of extremism in a geopolitical sense of, you know, we'll bring down anti-Semites and we'll bring down racists and we'll bring down, you know, extremists of all forms by forming diplomatic alliances. And I think there's something to what you're saying about that. I think it also bears on that not only do we have to stand up and confront anti-Semitism, but the flip side of the coin is, you know, as we're going to see, there are different types of anti-Semites, and there are those who are true believers, and all the education in the world or diplomacy in the world is probably not going to change their opinion. But there are others who subscribe to anti-Semitic points of view or align themselves with an anti-Semitic attitude because they have something to gain by it, to join a club, to get into a business venture, to you know, find their way into a, you know, social situation. It's kind of where anti-Semitism is used as a tool, not necessarily reflecting the deeper beliefs of that person. And I do think for people who are not true believers, that education can make a difference. And as you'll see, as we look at the history itself, that the main tropes of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are things that can be addressed through education and need to be addressed through education of people who've been raised with complete mis and disinformation about who and what Jews are, what we're about. So I want to thank you for your comment. I mean, it illustrates that dealing with anti-Semitism is both an organic process that we need to do in our daily lives and stand up to it, educate when we can, and call it out. But at the same time, building alliances through diplomacy is also a very important part of, protecting the safety of our community. So I thank you for that comment. A very good one.
Rabbi,
Uh-huh.
as you're talking, something is coming to my mind. I don't know exactly where it falls in your addressing the issue today, but I have been around, of course, I've been around anti-Semitism all my life, and it's been a very important internal driving force in my life in ways I do and don't understand. But I recall being around gatherings. I didn't know it was going to be a gathering of, say, predominantly Jewish Voice for Peace and others. And what I'm realizing now is there is an anti-Semitism, and I don't know if it's purely contemporary or not, that has to do with, but I know it is contemporary, has to do with the fact that there's hatred toward us because we have survived, because we have the state of Israel. But it's sort of like, oh, you must be an oppressor because there are others that are doing so much worse than you, and you're not, acknowledging that. But the fact is, you've survived, you have full citizenship, you're here, you're eating, you have a roof over your head. You're not, your home is not being burned down by a pogrom. Therefore, you are to be despised as an oppressor.
Well, what it is, you're absolutely right about that. And it is a kind of a new iteration.
Mhm.
In some ways it's a new iteration. In some ways it's not. The feeling about the Jewish people being separate and apart, taking care of their own, themselves, of, persistently surviving over the course of history, and that somehow that's an illustration either of that they have they're involved in a conspiracy to control the world, for example, or we are involved we have access to special things, and that is an old trope. What's happened though is it's been attached to the far left critique of
Yes.
white European colonialism. And so now you take the history of white European colonialism, which is a fact of history and a troubling fact of history, and the Jewish people is now being rolled into that history of institutional geopolitical subjugation and racism. And that becomes a very complicated conversation, because we managed to survive not because we were oppressors. We managed to survive because we have such a long history of having to adapt to new places, new languages, new situations for over 1,000 years, before we were ever wandering in the after we were wandering in the desert, we wandered across Europe for 1,000 years, really. And in that series of expulsions and resettlements and, I call it the dramatic flux of Jewish life during those 1,000 years, we learned how to adapt. And, you ask yourself, it's not just the resilience that's within the Jewish psyche and our value system and our ethics. But there's an adaptability that we show over and over again in history. And there's resentment about that. And there's fear about that. And let me flip that on its head just for a second. Oh my gosh, see what happens when we talk about these things. On the flip side, on the one hand, the world, some in the world, look at our survival and it's a source of resentment. But also you have to talk about the fact of our survival, what it's done to us as a people as well. And what it has also done is we had to continue to adapt one country after the next. In the Jewish psyche developed, and it has been written about in some depth, an idea of Jewish exceptionalism. And this Jewish exceptionalism is that, Jewish people, we have to study, we have to work hard, we have to be educated because we are already suspects in the greater society. So we have to try that much harder to prove to the outer society that you don't need to be suspicious of us. We're here, we just want to contribute to make the world a better place. And so you have this notion of Jewish exceptionalism, which, by the way, any psychologist present will understand that Jewish exceptionalism can cut both positively and negatively inside the heart and mind of a Jewish person, because that sense of exceptionalism, depending on your family of origin and how that was emphasized in your upbringing, can, create a lot of neurotic issues and anxiety, and things can flow out of that inner experience of Jewish exceptionalism. But the positive side of Jewish exceptionalism is there's a reason almost 25% of the Nobel Prizes have been given to people of Jewish origin. And that's another expression of Jewish exceptionalism. So our adaptability is a source of consternation for some. And for us, it helps explain, why we've managed to make it through so many societies and so many circumstances where people attempted to blot us out. Sharon, it's a really good comment. And
Well,
thank you for that.
just to add one more line to that is the equation, it seems to me often when I'm in these kind of social situations, not that I'm in them that often because I've really shut it down in my life, I've really shed some people in my life because of it, is that because we are alive and we do, as diverse as it is, we do have a culture, that must inevitably be, our lives are at the expense of others. Okay. The most basic, Israel exists at the expense of the Palestinians. I rest my case.
Understood. But when we unpack that kind of reaction, you realize often that there is a double standard at work in that kind of attitude. That, I used to make a joke that, from the world's perspective, the Jews are just like everybody else, just a little more so. Just like everybody else, but just a little more so. And that kind of captures this kind of double standard. The establishment of the state of Israel at the expense of is, it's easy to be reductionistic. And we can say the establishment of the United States was at the expense of, importing Black slaves. And we can look at examples of, tribalistically driven colonialism, and expansionism and imperialism. And it's, human history is littered with that. And I think it's good for us to have a global conversation about, how to stop doing it in the future. But I'm not sure we can't turn back the clock. We can do reparation, and we can do education and acknowledgement, and, learn how to be better listeners of different stories of victimization, without feeling this urge and compulsion to have to respond with our own story of victimization. I think there's a lot that we can do. People who, and I see this a lot lately, people who've made up their minds about something, whether they're being logical or not, it's very challenging to get people to take a step back and unpack what they have formulated into a firm belief about another person, another group of people. Open-mindedness is not what I would describe as at the top of, the values in public discourse. So I think it is a challenge. What we have to do in response to that reductionistic Israel was created at the expense of, is to actually just respond and say, well, actually, here is the story of how Israel was created. And really tell that story, which is, both has the feeling of miraculous, but was not just this arbitrary decision that just happened overnight. It evolved over, hundreds of years of discussion, both inside and outside the Jewish community, about, what do we do with the Jews? Because I will say this is now just Rob's own opinion. As much as, we suffered, the flux of history, not having a homeland after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, no citizenship until 1789, anywhere in the world until it was given to us in France. And we look back and we've survived it, and we embraced the Enlightenment, and we tried to continue wherever we lived to contribute to society. I mean, the irony of the Holocaust in Germany is that we Jews were the most integrated, loyal ethnic group in Germany at that time, among the most loyal and devoted Germans, and doing everything to adapt and mimic German culture. And then, of course, that didn't matter for them. I think that as much as we suffered and survived, and, in different places in the world, we were pushed around and exported and put before the Inquisition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The world was also wanting to find a solution to this problem of the Jews. Countries around the world just no one wanted to deal with us for the longest time. And so if you're going to talk about the story of the birth of the state of Israel, it was also partly the result of the world's will. So that all that energy of, expulsions and inquisitions and, let's just give them a place. And I don't think it was done to disenfranchise Palestinians living in that space. I happen to believe in a two-state solution. That's just my personal belief. So that, many people have lived in that land over history, but I think this is the good point to go on with this, with the program here, because, whoops, going the wrong way. Because I want to talk to you about people say, what is the Jewish right to the land of Israel, as if somehow, we took it away from others. And this morning, I'm going to show you exactly what the origin of our people is, and literally what our claim to the land is. So it's okay. Let's just move on to get through some of this material. So right now, different definitions of anti-Semitism are out there. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is the one most discussed. It was first published through the European Union in 2005. It's been adopted by the State Department since 2010. And it's often referred to as the State Department's working definition of anti-Semitism. And it says this: anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. It's a pretty generic definition of anti-Semitism. I do want you to take note of how it's spelled, by the way. You've seen it, anti-Semitism. It's really, the scholarly way of writing is one word, anti-Semitism, FYI. We also have ADL's definition of anti-Semitism from 2020, which I think is in some ways more meaningful. Anti-Semitism is the marginalization or oppression of people who are Jewish based on the belief in stereotypes and myths about Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. Historically, what began as ethnic prejudice and religious polemic evolved into a systematic policy of political, economic, and social isolation, exclusion, degradation, and attempted annihilation. It did not begin in the Nazi era, nor did it end with the close of World War II. Its continuance over the millennia speaks to the power of scapegoating a group that is defined as the other. If we're going to look at the history of anti-Semitism, I'm going to start off right from the beginning, where we came from. I think, well over a year ago, I actually shared this slide in another context, but it's very important in understanding our origins, and that is who we are, where we came from, because the original antipathy toward our group goes back to the very beginning. We were originally called the Hebrews. We were not called the Jewish people till much later in history. As you know, in ancient times, Egypt and Mesopotamia were the dominant empires of the ancient world. We're going back now at least 1800 BCE. So really just about 4,000 years ago, you have Egypt over here, and you have Mesopotamia and Assyria over here, and you have this region in the middle, in this side, the black circle. And between these two great civilizations, two things are bound to happen. One, trade, and the other, war. And there were two well-known trade routes between these two civilizations. One to the north, and that came down by the sea, by the Mediterranean, and one further to the east. It went down through the Judean desert and to Egypt. There was a group of people, indigenous people, living in this region who ran these trade routes. And they were ass caravanners. They didn't use camels. And they lived in what we call the Judean wilderness, and particularly into part of Jordan and Transjordan. And they crossed the north and the southern routes, and they had a name. They were called Apiru. Also known as Aviru, Aviru. You can hear the similar pronunciation of the V and the P. It is a Proto-Semitic word, meaning precedes Hebrew, Arabic. It's probably Ugaritic or Akkadian. And this word was descriptive of the people living here, meaning dusty ones. From like apiru in Hebrew, afar is dust. And so these dusty ones, also the word that described them is related to the word meaning to cross over something, over, aviru, the ones who crossed over, and it referred to them crossing these wildernesses, that they were wanderers. We read, for example, you've heard the phrase, my father was a wandering Aramean in the Passover Seder. And that's actually referring, that is such an early reference to the beginning origins of our ancestors as Apiru. Aramean was a put down word. It was like, these are gutter types. They were wandering, they had no home. They were just nomadic. They went from place to place. And you can see now, eventually this original word Apiru forms the basis of the word Hebrew. And you can see this down at the bottom. The Apiru became the Hebrews. So we have an indigenous history as the Hebrews, the Apiru, going back literally just about 4,000 years. Now understand the antipathy toward this group. We find it in the biblical narrative in Genesis. When we talk about Abraham, about 1800 BCE, as I mentioned before, he is described as one of these Apiru, in a sense, who begins to introduce a new tribal religion and culture. And look what Abraham does. Number one, he refuses to adopt other tribal religions that were around, refused to worship idols of stone. The people of Abraham and Sarah's time, were described in other literature as these people have strange practices like the Sabbath or new dietary restrictions. This early group, indigenous group, had a belief in an invisible God, which was revolutionary for that time. And all of this led to fear of the Hebrews that is first expressed actually openly and explicitly in the book of Exodus. Now, you remember Jacob's name is changed to Israel in Genesis 32. And it says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. You've struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And so when we read the phrase children of Israel in the Bible, it means literally the children of Jacob, the ancestors of Jacob. So then if we open up Exodus and we come, Exodus chapter 1, and this is the first outright textual description of antipathy toward our ancestors. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the Israelite people, here we go, the tropes. They are too numerous for us, right? We are prolific. We will grow. We have lots of babies. They will take over. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Just the thought that we are so untrustworthy, people have to be shrewd with us so that they may not increase. Otherwise, second trope, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. Second trope, we're disloyal, we're untrustworthy. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Do you see all the makings of the original equation, the tropes of hatred are right here. So it even says, and so how do the Jews react when we oppress them? They got stronger. They adapted. They did better. They increased. They spread out. And so because we were so able to survive, it caused more dread. And again, you can see this, expressed throughout history. And we just look at how the section ends. Hold on. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made their life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks, with all sorts of tasks in the field. And then, of course, we still were prolific, and we still adapted, and we still survived. So much so that finally the Pharaoh said that that the boys, if they're born of Hebrew slaves, should be killed. So just here in Exodus, we have all the basic, elements in the history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. We're too numerous. We can't be trusted. We are adaptable. No matter what you do, they will continue to survive. And then we need to dread these people. So we have nothing. What else can we do? We have to kill them. Now, you do know that you've heard this joke. Every Jewish holiday can be described in the following way. They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. Now, I'd say that sort of offhand, but the tropes have been around from time immemorial.
Rabbi.
Yep.
So on the one hand, I agree with you about saying hatred is learned. I completely agree with that. But like going back those thousands of years, what do you think was the origin of, why were the Jews hated then? I mean, so far back. I mean, was it just being different? I mean,
it was about being different. It was about rejecting many really deeply rooted social conventions. For example, well, we already mentioned rejecting idol worship.
Yeah.
Rejecting, other tribal authorities, dietary differences, an invisible deity. And, let's not forget that, our ancestors originally, we just had a loose-knit group of tribal associations amongst themselves. Here's another example. The standard in that time frame was primogeniture, which means the oldest son would inherit all the power, all the property of the father. But what do we read about in Genesis a number of times? The rejection of this social, convention of primogeniture, where the firstborn child is not the preferred child. And so you just had the birth of a social, religious, ethnic culture that was felt to be a threat to the norms of other cultures. And that's why we often talk about the earliest form of hatred toward us as kind of an ethnic hatred and fear. Because as we'll trace this through, the religion of Judaism really doesn't come into play until after the temple is destroyed in the year 70. And between the time of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and then we have the Israelite religion that begins under Moses and then finds its way established in Jerusalem through the centrality of the priesthood and the temple. And we always just kept to ourselves for the most part. But this original sentiment, just remember what we just looked at. We are prolific and will outnumber them. We are disloyal and would turn against them. We must be dealt with shrewdly. They are a source of dread. And
Rabbi,
some of the, I'd say-
I have a question about something you said.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So when you said the oldest child inherited everything, that was the oldest male child, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Rabbi, another distinction that was unheard of before Judaism was established was the Sabbath. Before that, the king or whoever, the nobleman, whatever it was, they expected the serfs to work 7 days a week, not 6, and rest on the 7th.
Absolutely correct. There's some evidence that Shabbat may be connected to a Mesopotamian tradition of a similar name called Shabbatum. And actually, it represented the days in the course of a month when the marketplace would be closed by order of the king. But it wasn't even based on the notion of a day of rest. I always say that was the day they counted their money. And the Shabbatum presumably was observed on the 7th, 14th, 17th, 21st, 27th, and 28th of every month. Anything with the multiple 7 or with the number 7, markets were closed. And that's just based on some archaeological evidence. And that maybe in the Hebrew ethnic culture, where we were definitely influenced by Mesopotamian tradition. And after all, our calendar is built on the Mesopotamian calendar, that Shabbat eventually became adapted into what you just described, Charles. And yes, that was unheard of at that time. So eventually we have the birth of what is known as anti-Judaism. And anti-Judaism is clearly the result of the advent of Christianity. And this new phenomenon, anti-Judaism, evolved, different from ethnic antipathy we find in the Hebrew Bible. Christianity, to just be reminded, was first known as another Jewish sect. And Jesus and the disciples were Jewish and preached a form of Judaism during his lifetime. But differences began to emerge to differentiate Judaism and Christianity. And eventually early Christianity attempted to reach out to Gentile converts. And what began as a version of Judaism eventually became a separate religion, while both of them claimed a common root, the Hebrew scriptures, or what in Christianity is called the Old Testament, because it possesses an old, as some Christians believe, outdated and obsolete covenant. Whoops. And during the first few hundred years after the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans, adherents of both Judaism and Christianity coexisted, sometimes peacefully and sometimes with tension. And some early Christians viewed the Jewish refusal to accept Jesus as the Jewish Messiah as another instance of their stubbornness, and later as a sign of their supposed hatred of Jesus and Christianity. Understand we've talked about this a few months ago, the Jewish Messiah, different from what we eventually learn about the Christian Messiah. The Jewish Messiah was always going to be a human being, not a cosmic character, who would restore the kingship of the Jewish people in the same spirit of the kingship of David, and return Israel back to Jewish sovereignty, take it away from Roman occupation, or in earlier times, take it away from Babylonian occupation. And Messiah means anointed, or the anointed king of the Jewish people. And there were those in the time of Jesus who actually thought Jesus was, in fact, that Jewish messianic character. And there were others in the Jewish community who did not. And don't forget, Jesus was not the only example of individuals who either proclaim themselves as the Jewish Messiah, which in Rome is sedition against the state at that time. But there were others who pointed at other people and said, that one right there, that's going to be our next king. That's going to be our Messiah. And that was a form of sedition as well. Jesus was crucified for the crime of sedition against the Roman state. And you may remember, you've seen some crucifixes that have 4 letters on the top referring to 4 Latin words. And those 4 letters, INRI, refer to Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And they presumably the Romans put that up on a crucifix at the time of the crucifixion as a mockery, saying, here, you Jews, here's your king. Look at him. There he is. And so we have the birth of anti-Judaism. And again, just to understand how we've differed, I said the Jewish Messiah is the anointed human king of the Jews. The word Messiah is translated into Christos and then eventually into the word Christ. But understand, unlike the Jewish Messiah, the Christian Messiah is a cosmic Messiah, a cosmic Christ, God incarnate in physical form, who died for the sins of humanity as like the ultimate example of substitution theology. His death brings out the redemption for the sins of everyone else living. And of course, that is the beginning, really the beginning of Christianity, and what really differentiates us from Christians. Now, the primary manifestation of this emerging anti-Judaism was the idea that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, known as deicide. That was the big accusation against us. Christians also sought to validate their religion by claiming it was the continuation of biblical Israel and had superseded Judaism and the Jews. And that's called secessionism. And that also formed the basis of what in the Catholic Church was the problem of the Jews. Now we've succeeded them. We are now the new Israel, as is said in much of early Catholic tradition. But now what do we do with these people? Now, initially, Christianity was not recognized as a legitimate religion by Roman authorities, but it did continue to grow. And eventually, in 325, Constantine called together the Council of Nicaea, and they had the first formulation of Christian doctrine. And Constantine eventually converted to Christianity and began to favor Christianity and remove the legal impediments to its practice. In 380, Emperor Theodosius I made it the empire's sole authorized religion. All this not good for the Jews. And the marriage of religion and state power would have significant consequences for us. And so this anti-Judaism that was partly built on theology became an institutionalized anti-Judaism in the Roman Empire. and what became known as the Jewish problem was born. And during the next 3 centuries, a new pattern of institutionalized discrimination against Jews emerged. We were forbidden to marry Christians, prohibited from holding positions in government, prevented from appearing as witnesses against Christians in court, and Jews were now officially being ostracized throughout the Holy Roman Empire. There are also bizarre fantasies about Jews that arose in Northern Europe that foreshadowed the anti-Semitism of the 20th century. It was alleged that Jews were in league with the devil, had horns and tails, and engaged in ritual murder of Christians, thus reenacting their murder of Jesus. The latter allegation, referred to as the blood libel, was devised by Thomas of Monmouth in 1150 to explain the mysterious death of a Christian boy. In 1095, Pope Urban II made a general appeal to the Christians of Europe to take up the cross and sword and liberate the Holy Land from Muslims, beginning what was to be known as the Crusades. The religious fervor that drove men and later even children on the Crusades was to have direct consequences for the Jews. The Crusader army, which more closely resembled a mob, swept through Jewish communities, looting, raping, and massacring Jews as they went. Thus, the pogrom, the organized massacre of a targeted group of people, was born. And it should be noted that popes and other church officials opposed violence against the Jews, but were generally unable to control public sentiment. Again, this is the history of anti-Semitism, my friends. During the middle of the 14th century, the bubonic plague spread throughout Europe. An estimated 1/3 of the population were killed. Fear, superstition, and ignorance prompted the need to find someone to blame. The Jews were a convenient scapegoat because of the myths and stereotypes that were already believed about them, about us. Though Jews were also dying from the plague, they were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. Because of an historical pattern of good hygiene, fewer Jews died. In Germany and Austria, it's estimated that 100,000 Jews were burned alive for being blamed for this and other false accusation, including using the blood of Christian boys to make Passover matzah. Images of Jews in Christian church art, murdering Christian children, suckling from the teats of pigs, etc., were used to inflame the masses. Here is an example of one of those. And this is a group of Jews who are now slaughtering a Christian child. How do we know it's a Christian child? Because it's not a circumcised child. That was the attempt to describe the blood libel, if you look closely at the picture. Another example of a characterization of Jews killing a Christian child. And then, and you can't talk about the history of anti-Semitism without talking about Martin Luther, the most famous theologian of the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation wrote a pamphlet in 1545 entitled "The Jews and Their Lies," and claimed that Jews thirsted for Christian blood, urging the slaying of Jews. And what many people don't know, the Nazis reprinted it in 1935. And then we come to a key point in the history of this antipathy and treatment of our people, where we make a transition from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism. Some scholars feel that the attacks, particularly around Martin Luther's attacks, marked the beginning of a transition from anti-Judaism, which is attacks motivated because of Jews' refusal to accept Christianity, to anti-Semitism, which is hatred of Jews as a so-called race that would contaminate the purity of another race. It's an important distinction, which sometimes gets lost in discussion. And so as a result, there was marginalization and villainization, not just because of religion, but for all kinds of reasons. Jews were subjected to political, economic, and social discrimination, resulting in the deprivation of their legal and civil rights. beginning in the 13th century, Jews were required to wear a distinctive symbol, a badge, or a pointed hat, so they could be immediately recognized. And of course, that action was revisited by the Nazis in the 20th century. And the restrictions also increased as the 16th and 17th centuries evolved. Jews were not allowed to own land, employ Christians, join certain guilds. The church did not allow Christians to loan money for profit, and Jews had few alternatives, and we did become money lenders.
Rabbi, are you talking about primarily Europe right now? Where are you talking?
Well, I am talking about Europe.
Okay, and so during all this time, what about in what is now Israel, that area?
Well, we didn't have any control of the land during that time, but throughout history, from the time the temple was destroyed in the year 70, and then different empires, from the Romans to the Turks and to the British and others that took over their, I call it transient ownership. Throughout that entire history, there were always a high concentration of people of Jewish origin living in the land of Israel. Yes, there are also Palestinians and people of other origin that live there, came there under Turkish rule, came there under British rule. And yes, there are people who can also claim long history of attachment to that land. There's no question. But I would ask we not today get into a discussion around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, if that's okay. I think that's a discussion for another time. And I think what I want to do is let's just pause here for a second. Oops, where'd everybody go?
We can see your screen, but I'm not sure
There we
exactly.
go. I just took
Okay.
that down. So let's pause at that point and see if you have any questions or comments.
This has been fascinating.
This is the history, again, Rob's condensed history of anti-Semitism. And right now we're right up to almost to the Enlightenment. We're up to like the 17th century, and things, of course, evolve again in terms of the history of anti-Semitism, and then of course Nazism. And if you'd like to see the end of that part of the presentation, I'm happy to share it. But I also think let's just pause here for a moment and see if anyone has any comments up to this point in the story. And I think all of us have heard like little smatterings of this information, but it's good to see it in sequence. It's good to see it, how it builds and develops over time.
It really is. I find it very, very helpful to see that progression. It means a lot more. I mean, just to have that context.
So it's kind of like ethnic hatred and, religious hatred, and then hatred to us as a group by our sheer existence.
Mhm.
And you can see they build on each other.
It's interesting even to move it up.
Oh, Neil, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
It's interesting to bring it to a more modern time. And I don't mean today, but I believe, Rabbi, you had mentioned you have a copy of this book, The International Jew, by
Yep.
Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Automobiles. And
Still can't hear you, Neil.
it is titled The International Jew,
Yes,
the World's Foremost Problem.
correct. You want to skip ahead to that at this point? Or do you want to hear about the in-between part?
See, wherever you want to go, it's just something that, a lot of people don't recognize that it was ever that prevalent, literally given out at Ford dealerships, handed out. And
Yeah, it comes up a little later in this presentation, but I will show it to you. This is what we're talking about. The International Jews is an actual volume produced by Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. And unless anyone has any other questions, why don't we go back and we'll just see what leads up to this.
Mhm.
All right, so let's go back to here.
You money lender.
So we talked about, becoming money lenders. And we found for a little time there in this, late medieval period, as long as Jews benefited the ruler, either through finance or by serving as convenient scapegoats, we were tolerated. But when it suited the ruler, we were expelled. And here's just a short list. Expelled from England in 1290, France in 1394, Spain in 1492, Warsaw, Sicily, Lithuania, and Portugal in 1483, Brandenburg 1510, the Papal State, in 1569, Italy and Bavaria in 1593, and elsewhere. And in the 16th century, Jews began to be restricted and forced into areas like we now know as ghettos. Most notably in Venice, known as the Ghetto Nuovo, meaning the new foundry, the first ghetto of many such examples that followed. Just to know, the term anti-Semitism was coined in 1879 by Wilhelm Marr, a German political agitator, in his work, Victory of Judaism over Germanism. His thesis was that Jews were conspiring to run the state and should be expelled from citizenship. Anti-Semitism in Marr's conception was linked to the Jews as a people rather than to Judaism as a religion. And then also, important pivotal event, the Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew who was a captain in the French army, was falsely accused and convicted of selling military secrets to the Germans. When evidence was discovered that Dreyfus was innocent, it was quickly covered up by French officers of the general staff who wanted to blame the crime on a Jew. Although Dreyfus was eventually vindicated, the Dreyfus Affair, as it became known, showed how deep-rooted and pervasive anti-Semitism was in France. And then in 1903, and this is going to eventually connect up with the International Jew of Henry Ford, in 1903 in Russia, Tsar's secret police, at least that's the theory, published a forged collection of documents that became known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It told of a secret plot by rabbis to take over the world. It's also important to note that racism and anti-Semitism were also facilitated by the development of social Darwinism and the pseudo-scientific notions based on theories of racial superiority and inferiority. And what do I mean? How is social Darwinism as an idea figure into the development of so-called race science? It's because, of course, Darwin believed in natural selection, that the strong survive and the weak don't. That was a matter of necessity. Those who survive are the most adaptable, which, of course, from a position of social Darwinism, we've done remarkably well. But in the time when Darwin was writing about this, it became a convenient tool in the development of racial theories of superiority. Again, because in the notion of natural selection, superior races should eventually overtake and eventually blot out inferior races based on this notion of natural selection and social Darwinism. In Russia, there was also a unique kind of anti-Semitism. Although most Jews themselves were extremely poor, they were blamed for all the problems of the Russian peasantry. Pogroms were instigated by the Tsar's secret police in part to deflect anger from the regime, another case of scapegoating. The Russian Orthodox Church often abetted the police through anti-Jewish sermons. And in 1905, Russia's loss in the Russo-Japanese War moved the government to incite a bloody pogrom in Kishinev between 1917 and 1921. After the Russian Revolution, more than 500 Jewish communities in the Ukraine were wiped out in pogroms, and about 60,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. And then we have American anti-Semitism. And there are a number of important characters in the expression of American anti-Semitism, Henry Ford being the most notable, who was a friend and financial patron of Hitler. And as Neil brought out just a few moments ago, he developed the International Jew. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop that just for a second. And so how this started for Ford is he published a newspaper for years and years and years called the Dearborn Independent. And in every issue of the Dearborn Independent, there was an editorial, an anti-Semitic editorial about one or another aspect of the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Eventually, and by the way, the Dearborn Independent was required to be sold at all Ford dealerships everywhere. Eventually, all those editorials were put together into the book. So all the articles in here were originally editorials. And then the book was produced and was also in October 1920. And I'll read just some of the titles of these editorials. The Jew in Character and Business. The Jewish Estimate of Gentile Human Nature. Is the Jewish Kahal the modern Soviet? An Introduction to the Jewish Protocols, referring to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So eventually Ford collected all the editorials and put them in 2 volumes, at least 2, maybe 3. I have 2 of them. Fortunately, one of them doesn't have a cover, and this became merchandise of the Ford Motor Company for a very long time.
Rabbi, I know it's tangential, but I'm just so curious. Did the company ever recant that?
Oh, yes. His children and grandchildren all have since consistently rejected the view of the first Henry Ford, and have disavowed and absolutely denounced that part of their history, of that family and that company.
All right, so we don't have to go burn our Ford truck. Okay.
No. The second other major character in early 20th century was Father Charles Coughlin, who had a national radio program, who was a rabid anti-Semite. And you've heard also Charles Lindbergh and others who were notable characters of that time period. And so the stage is set during the political turmoil that followed the defeat of Germany in World War I, the legacy of Christian anti-Judaism and the new pseudoscientific anti-Semitism enabled nationalist leaders once again to scapegoat the Jews as the source of all the world's problems, and particularly the problems in Germany. In the early 20th century, Germany was perceived as really one of the centers of the intellectual and scientific world, indeed the center of the civilized world, at least that's how they looked at it. And since anti-Semitism was and remains woven into the very fabric of Christianity and Western culture and was ubiquitous throughout Europe, many have asked why it was Germany that perpetrated the Holocaust. And here's the reason. Following World War I, Germany was a deeply troubled country. Having lost the war, its citizens felt humiliated by defeat. The victorious countries, including the United States, France, and England, authored the Treaty of Versailles. By the way, if you've never gone and read the Treaty of Versailles, you should, because it is one of the most pivotal documents of all of modernity. It was a peace treaty which compelled Germany to give up territory, to pay reparations to countries whose lands it had damaged, and that really helped foster its economy into a free fall. This was particularly demoralizing to the German people and made them susceptible to a demagogue like Adolf Hitler. Hitler offered the German a vision of a Germany whose power and prestige would be restored. He drew upon accumulated legacy of anti-Semitism to evoke fear that the Jews would contaminate what he referred to as the superior Aryan race. Therefore, according to Hitler's doctrine, all Jews and their genetic pool must be eliminated. I'm going to skip this slide and just talk about post-Holocaust for a moment. Since the Holocaust, there has in fact been a deep reflection by the Catholic Church about its role in the Holocaust and a concerted, focused effort at reconciliation. After the Holocaust, after the world witnessed the horrors of Auschwitz, anti-Semitism became far less accepted for a time. Seeing what anti-Semitism could lead to made peoples and nations ashamed of openly expressing anti-Semitism, but as I said, only for a time. And we've seen now upsurge in anti-Semitism around the world. We have the fastest growth in anti-Semitic incidents around the world right now. And it goes back, they are utilizing the age-old anti-Semitic charges, blood libels, and Jews using evil power to control the world. Now I want to give you some current information. Polls show that large numbers of Europeans believe that their Jewish citizens are not loyal to the countries in which they live, that they have a disproportionate amount of political and economic power. The growth of ethnic nationalism and white supremacy and the explosion of online anti-Semitism demonstrate that anti-Semitism is still not just a significant problem, but becoming a critical problem. The resurgence of anti-Semitism is great concern because we move further away from the lessons of the Holocaust and the survivor community begins to pass away. We have less living testimony to the atrocity. It's true, we do have allies in the United States and around the world who will not forget the lessons of history and will still stand with us against this sinister hatred. So my last slide that I put up for today, and that's a brief history of anti-Semitism. With all of this, we still say today for Rosh Chodesh Adar, be happy. And I bring it back to where we started, is that you learn this, and trust me, what I shared now in an hour and 15 minutes, I usually teach in the course of a 9-week course, and we look more in depth at all of it. So you look at this, you look at its development and its redevelopment and its redevelopment, and it's almost like, it's like a virus that keeps mutating. A psychic virus, a spiritual virus that keeps mutating. And yet, in the month when we celebrate Purim, we're told to be happy. And, you know, Judaism is filled with all kinds of incredible irony. We break a glass at the happiest moment at a wedding to remind us that life also has brokenness. And that we should be realistic, not just hopeful, but realistic. Jews don't wear rose-colored glasses, but we're still hopeful. So why would it say, be happy? When Purim is really about capturing, in one story, the persistence of Haman in every generation. Say one last thing and then I'll stop. You can all please respond. I hope you will. You know, in the Bible, the Israelites marched across the desert and they confronted a lot of other tribes. And yes, that was a period in our history where we were somewhat imperialistic ourselves in the early growth of Israelite religion. But there's one tribe in the Bible that is cursed, really, just one, and that's the Amalekites, the people of Amalek. And because even in ancient times, there were conventions of war, conventions of engagement. War was fought usually by a class of warriors. But the tribe of Amalek made no bones of attacking encampments at night, killing women and children first, with brutality that even in ancient times was beyond the pale. And so the writers of the Torah on a number of occasions say the following: blot out the name of Amalek from under the heavens. Remember, do not forget. And it's very interesting. On the one hand, it says blot out, but on the other hand, it says remember. Again, another one of these wonderful apparent contradictions right within the Bible itself. Blot them out, but don't forget. Blot them out, but don't forget. And it's the idea that Amalek will reappear in a different guise in every generation. And so the story of Haman becomes the archetypical story of Amalek. And the story of Haman is the archetypical story of, Hitler and others who set out to destroy the Jewish people, as you can now see, for an evolving set of reasons. And yet, Jewish tradition says to us, when you hear the story of Haman and you blot Haman's name out, like we blot out Amalek's name, still be happy. Why? What are we supposed to really be happy about? And it's not the simplistic answer, we survived, let's eat. Right? It's something much deeper than that. That we're supposed to feel satisfaction and joy and happiness in the face of all this. Anyone want to take that one?
Rabbi, can I just say something?
Of course.
I've been thinking about this whole sort of history of scapegoating and anti-Semitism. And the thing about it, and this is coming from my personal experience as well, having been a survivor of narcissistic abuse, people who are scapegoated are often scapegoated because they see through what's going on, the dysfunctions, what's going on, and yet they're able to survive and adapt. And it's the same history. It's so tied into our history, Jewish history. So one thing about you learn when you serve as a survivor is that people will project their own sense of deep inferiority or their deep sense of inadequacy to those who are able to do things that they are afraid to do or they are unaware of how to do, okay? So there's a sense of like scapegoating Jews for being able to survive, speak different languages, adapt to different cultures, and produce good things in spite of a lot of pain. So I think that when you survive, you go, I'm never going to forget this kind of behavior because I'm not going to be trapped again by this kind of behavior or be abused by this kind of behavior. So you have to remember the kind of people and the kind of behaviors that are about exclusion, scapegoating, objectifying, exile, all that. On the other hand, there's deep joy in having survived. So, I mean, you said, don't bring it to let's eat, we've survived, but there is a sense of the joy of survival that somehow I think we're learning the lessons of life and how to be alive much faster. We've had to learn it. And life is like that. You have to be both careful and yet rejoice in the fact that we're able to keep life going. That's my take on it, just because of my own personal experience with being scapegoated, so, and then, the merging of that with Jewish history. I don't know if that means, that makes sense to you and to, in terms of how I explain this.
Oh, it makes perfect sense, and you explained it very well. And I think it's always beneficial to try to understand the forces of the world through the lens of our own experience, and to see it in a psychosocial context, I think is very, very powerful. And I thank you for sharing it in such a personal way. I imagine most of us, maybe not all, hopefully not all, we can relate to what you're describing through our own life experience as well. I look at it a little, I describe it a little bit, well, similarly to you, but I add gaslighting into the equation.
Absolutely.
There's
Absolutely.
that a lot of the psychosocial dynamic revolves around the oppressors trying to gaslight the victims. And what real survival ends up looking like is when you finally see the gaslighting for what it is, and then you stand up for the truth.
Absolutely.
Your own personal, psychic, social, spiritual truth. And it's that very act, of course, is what antagonizes the hater even more. And,
Absolutely.
And so I think I completely I agree with what you're saying. And I think it's a profound way of connecting up our individual personal life journeys to realization with the patterns of psychosocial behavior in the world around us. Now, it raises another question, and that is, so in a way, it really points out the most important way to fight anti-Semitism is in how we live as individuals, how we respond to conflict, how we deal with each other, and to gaslighting behaviors and the like. And I've always believed that, the solution to one of the most important responses to anti-Semitism is what we do at the organic level. I'll just tell you something about my background. Some of you may know, some of you don't, but when I took my first position as a solo pulpit rabbi, my first rabbinical position was actually at Temple Emmanuel in Denver as an assistant for 3 years. And then I went to Greenwich, Connecticut to a fledgling group of 40 Jewish families that rented one room in the basement of an Episcopal church. And we were in that church for 8 years before we found a home and we moved out. But during those 8 years, I had a daily interfaith experience with the rector of that Episcopal church, with the staff. We had pulpit exchanges. We would teach Bible together. And that was just the obvious thing that we should do since we were living together. And that set me on a course to a belief that real interfaith dialogue only really happens at the organic level. And that's really where change happens. And the last time I preached at St. Paul's Episcopal Church was the Sunday when we carried our Torah scrolls from the church to our new synagogue through town. And God, it still makes me emotional to think about it, that I said to them in a truly honest, candid statement, also reflecting my youth at the time, I think. I'm not sure I was as circumspect as I could have or should have been. But I said to them, you know, these years here living with you as our brothers and sisters, I said, I know in my heart that if there were ever a pogrom here in Greenwich, Connecticut, that we could knock on the door of this church and you would take care of us. So I really believe that, going back to the comment at the beginning, where is the most important diplomacy supposed to take place? That's on the organic level. I've seen interfaith dialogue and at the national pinnacle level of dialogue, and it's, I would say at best, it's impotent. But the real response, I think, is, you know, built on what so many of you have said today. It's on how we maintain our core values and how we build relationships with other people who will understand us for who we are.
I agree with you 1,000%. I mean, I feel like it's so important, like for our young people to travel and be exposed to other cultures, religions. I mean, I haven't traveled a ton, but when I have, that's been one of the most powerful things is, you know, having those connections with people from totally different cultures. And I've had many people like be shocked. They're like, oh, you know, they just had never, they didn't know, you know, this is what a Jew is like. Oh, this is what an American is like. They didn't know, you know, and it just, there's nothing like it. Nothing like it.
I'll just tell you two quick stories. You know, one, when I was in Greenwich, and we had this grocer, really nice Italian man who had two small grocery stores that served most of the little town. And between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, like 4 days before Yom Kippur, he put an ad, a full-page ad in the Greenwich Time, the newspaper, daily newspaper, saying, you know, happy Yom Kippur to all our Jewish friends, lobsters, $2 a pound on sale. True story. And I can tell you the Jewish community went nuts. They did, they just lost it. Like, oh, this guy is ignorant, he's stupid, he's an anti-Semite, blah, 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 blah. And the worst part is I had to rewrite my sermon for Yom Kippur like 2 days before. And I had to talk about this and say, wait. He was trying to do a good deed. His ignorance is our fault. His mistake, we have to bear that mistake, right? And we need to talk to him more and let him know what we're about. And, you know, sometimes people's ignorance, it's partly their fault, but maybe not completely their fault. We have a role to play to correct that. And the other story is, this is true. When I was in Arkansas, not so many years ago, 5 years ago, I had a church group come to the synagogue where I was the rabbi in residence. And I'm doing a thing before Shabbat services. And this is like 2015, 16. And the Sunday school teacher, during the question and answer, raises hand and says, Rabbi, you know, we read so much about, you know, God's people in the Old Testament. I'm just curious, where do you keep the animals for the sacrifices? 2016. And that's just ignorance. It's total lack of exposure. And being, I'm sorry to say, fed a very narrow bandwidth of knowledge.
Yeah.
You know, and from this, we could go on and we could have another discussion about, you know, what we see happening in the world now, which is just mind-boggling, is how people will consciously choose ignorance over knowledge. I mean, choose it, like intentionally choose the ignorant path. And it's mind-boggling. And the internet, you know, has created so many fact bases that, you know, you have people that can clearly discern what is fact and what is not, and people who can't, and now people who won't. And when we talk about anti-Semites, I'll just say, you know, there are anti-Semites who can be educated out of their ignorance, or they're using anti-Semitism. And then there are some people who are true believers. It's not even worth the effort.
Well,
You know, to that point, Rabbi, when what's happening, and I hate to get, I don't want to really go down the political realm, but politically speaking, the way that we are being, the separation that's being caused through politics, the divisiveness, it's deep in the heart of Judaism at this point. I mean, you know, you talk, and I don't mean amongst each and every Jew, but I mean, you know, the left and the right, the conservative and the more progressive. You know, I've heard from conservative Jews, how could you really be Jewish and not believe this? And I've heard Jews from the other side. And the fact that you believe that makes you, you know, anti-Semite almost. So it's creating these divisions within us. And I'm just trying to figure out how do you grapple with that? I mean, you can certainly avoid the conversation, but I've never been one to try to avoid a conversation.
Well,
I guess I've done that too long in my life, and nowadays I'd rather get in the conversation and not dance around it.
so I'm going to show you something. I'm going to bring this back up on the screen because I do want to show you something that's pretty powerful. I often teach the history of anti-Semitism in the context of teaching about the reality of hate. And I once taught a course on othering and looked at some philosophers who've done some extensive writing about what othering is, and not just a psychological analysis, but in terms of, you know, an epistemological analysis, like how is it that people come to view the world and define the world in polarizing ways, and what is the source of othering. And when I teach that course, I usually begin and I say, why do we teach this course? And I answer the question with the following, which I'm going to show you right now. Whoops, I think that's the wrong, yeah, this is it.
The National Conference of Christians and Jews have the help of Richard Rogers at the piano and Oscar Hammerstein in setting the mood of Brotherhood Week with one of their famous tunes.
In the second act of South Pacific, a young American Navy nurse explaining her race prejudice says, "I can't help this. This is emotional. It's born in me." And the second character, the man who is losing her because of this prejudice, shouts his protest. "I do not believe this. I do not believe these things are born in you." And a third character, a young Marine lieutenant, played by my friend here, Bill Tabbert, says, "It's not born in you.
It happens after you're born. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
Whoops. There you have it.
Yeah. That's amazing.
How do you unteach people so that they don't other people? That's, to me, that's the basic question. And if we don't start talking more about that, boy,
Yeah.
I fear that the world's future will just be this pendulum, because you know what happens, people won't do anything until it gets so bad they can't stand it anymore. And then all of a sudden the pendulum will swing around to the other way. But that conversation about in education and upbringing, how we don't raise kids to hate the people their relatives hate. To me, is very much in the heart of the conversation and why it's all very organic to begin with.
Makes me think of all the school
Can I
boards.
just add something?
Of course, you don't need to ask.
Just, I think there's a fundamental difference in the way people are thought to think about themselves and others in other religions, whether it's Christianity or Islam or, maybe not as much in tribal religions, but there's a sense of, in Judaism, it's very important to discuss and have different opinions and to have that back and forth discussion. Whereas, and to arrive at a truth, and truth is not just one. Whereas most societies, following either Islam or people groups, let's say Christianity, have to somehow conform to an accepted fiction. I call it fiction or a fantasy or whatever about what is the truth. So those that question that, meaning the Jews, because the way we think about reality or how to arrive at a reality that is reasonable, are considered suspect. What do you think about that, Rabbi? Is that we think differently about reality and to belong to a group as we think about reality? Does that make, did I explain myself?
You did.
Okay.
I would say that I agree and I don't agree.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. I agree with what you're saying, that there are unique aspects to how within Jewish culture we emphasize verbal expression, we emphasize logical thinking, and we try to give kids the opportunity, at least I hope we do, to learn as much about how to think as opposed to what to think.
Exactly.
However, I worry when I hear that kind of a message that you're sharing as if we're unconsciously then being part of the problem we're criticizing by actually being reductionistic about other Jews. And like, the fact is, we have ultra-Orthodox communities here in the United States that are very self-contained, where I would say there are clear social, psychological codes and conventions of conduct and belief.
True.
And while I'm more familiar with criticism coming from that realm toward me and the realm I live in, which is different, I don't want to get into criticizing that realm, because part of, I think, developing true inclusiveness is to also accept people who may choose to want to be separate. I think we have to allow people to be separate as long as their separateness isn't used to hurt anyone else.
Mhm.
And so I agree that there are unique qualities in our, call it the gestalt of Jewish experience. But at the same time, I don't like to be reductionistic about the Jewish people. I mean, we have 3 Jews, we have 6 opinions at all times. And, you know, and I like to say, as Jews, this is something I haven't thought of before. There's a thing I just made this up, intellectual generosity.
Yes.
And, you know, when people live in a narrow bandwidth of information, knowledge, exposure, you know, it doesn't lend itself to intellectual generosity. It lends itself to intellectual self-preservation, and people in that frame of the universe, you know, they strive to be in an echo chamber. But that's not really at the heart of Judaism. But actually, if we're honest about it, even within Judaism, we have people that have now, especially lately, retreated into their own echo chambers, even in the Jewish community.
True.
And so what you're saying, I think, raises a very complex issue, and I'm glad you said it. Maybe it's not that I disagree, it's that I always try to self-monitor when I start talking about other groups of Jewish people. So I don't myself fall into the trap of being deterministic about what other people are thinking or feeling. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does.
And not just other groups of Jewish people.
Rabbi, this was a wonderful program.
Yeah, sorry, we've gone on so long. We should stop. Thank you, Charles.
Yashikoa.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Any last parting comments? Boy, I appreciate all of you. Appreciate all of you very much.
I love your teachings.
Yeah, it's just great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.
We learned,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
we learned together. Really.
Thank you.
All right, well, Shabbat Shalom. Take care.
You too.
Shalom,
Amen.
everyone.
Shalom.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Take
Bye.
care.